gorgeous. Trump's first term is a prelude. In this article, you argue that Trump governed more like a traditional Republican than a fascist strongman, which kind of is the narrative that we get in mainstream media, right? He's a fascist. We have to get the fascists out of office, make sure we don't get a fascist in office. Why do you think that was the case, and what factors might make his potential second term different?
Well, I think that his election took everyone by surprise, including the Trump campaign and including the conservative establishment, the conservative movement, rather, and the Republican establishment. No one had a plan for what to do in case Trump becomes president because nobody thought it would happen. And as a result, when he comes into office, he's got a long list of grievances and promises that he promised to settle.
Mm-hmm.
And no real loyalists inside certainly not the federal government, very few inside the Republican Party, right? Many people might be too young to remember when figures like Marco Rubio, Leslie Graham, J.D. Vance, in fact, were never Trumper idealists, right? That he was the American Hitler that they needed to close ranks to prevent from ascending to power. And he also didn't have much of a footprint in the conservative movement because
He spent the first half of his adult life as a Democrat.
precisely, he's a rich New York property developer with no relationship with Jesus and no connection to, right, like hardline concerns.
You know, it's I know we're around. I'm a little older than you, but and you grew up in Canada, which is not the States, but still, I'm sure you got some of that gossip television that was so prevalent in the 80s, which is where, I'm introduced to Donald Trump, right? Through shows like Current Affair and stuff like that. He was the most popular
Oh,
socialite.
Marla Maples, right?
The Marla Maples scandal was like all I knew so much about a guy like Donald Trump, even decades before we get to the Apprentice era. Donald Trump, and he's, to me, he's kind of this fascinating figure that was able to maintain this level of fame for really not doing anything other than fucking up. But his fucking up, while epic, never becomes part of his narrative. He managed to kind of control it.
Yeah, I think that there's a reason for that. Part of it, and this relates to something that you asked in your questions, has to do with how keen his sense is for media narratives, for what journalists pick up, what kind of things get repeated, what tropes resonate with audiences, how to tap into audiences. He has a knack for that. That's something that he's done, and that's something that he's gotten quite good at. One thing that he has never done is governed in any capacity before 2016. And he had never thought about it, and he was not good at it. He had no plan for it. He had no interest in it. Compared to the areas where he really shines, which are dick measuring alpha male negotiations about sketchy properties and financial crime and catty media alpha girl gossip. Those areas he knows how to work. He knows what to do. But when it comes to dealing with an extensive bureaucracy or learning about a geopolitically significant region or having trade agreements explained to him, he doesn't have the patience, he doesn't have the interest, he doesn't believe that it's important. And his model coming into the White House was the same as coming into the penthouse at Trump Towers. Who's the butler, right? Who do I tell what I want? and then I just sit around watching Fox News, taking phone calls until they do it. And he was not prepared for a situation in which he has this extensive, expansive um, apparatus at his control, people who, in theory, work for him, quote unquote, but who just won't do as they're told. And then when you complain about them, you can't get them fired. Instead, you get other people defending them and explaining how you can't really get them to do what you want, even though you're, in theory, the CEO in chief, or however he conceives of his position. He obviously had no grounding in any kind of constitutional legal reference to his role and his position. He just thought that he could come in and, whether it was his chief of staff or Ivanka or Jared Kushner or whoever, there'd be somebody that he could yell at in order to get what he wanted, and then he would get what he wanted. Um, Turns out he can't even stop investigations by the FBI or the Justice Department into his own dealings. And he took that rather badly, like cut to Michael Jordan, and I took that personally. Um, but he also didn't have a plan for how to address it, or even an awareness that something like this could happen. And what it allowed during the first his first term was, whenever establishment Republicans thought they could get something that they wanted anyway, things like corporate tax cuts or things like conservative justice appointments, everything was very easy because the system of government, the Republican Party, the agencies of state were all in agreement that this was something that Trump had the power to do. So
Mhm.
he was allowed to carry it out. Um, when he had plans that ran against establishment interests, um, sometimes insanely irresponsible ideas, sometimes ideas that might, in other circumstances, be sensible ones, but which ran against establishment opposition, then either agencies inside the federal government could slow walk implementation, or they could ask for judicial review by legal departments who would take forever to come up with an opinion, and then they would come up with an opinion which was ambiguous and suggest that further review is necessary. Sometimes his own appointees simply refused to carry out his orders. There's a famous conference call with then Department of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, where Trump was reacting very badly to a perceived slight by Bashar al Assad and called for large scale bombing, assassination attempts, all kinds of trouble. When Trump left the call, Mattis told everyone on it, yeah, we're just not going to do that. And this is in Fear, the Woodward, one of the Woodward Trump biographies, one of the accounts of the Trump White House. Similar things happened with economic policy. Mnuchin would occasionally run his own policies and get Trump to sign off on something in a giant stack of files. And by and large, they could get away with it. After all, the Justice Department, which in theory might be used to discipline members of the executive that go off book, well, that was busy investigating the chief executive. It was stacked with people that we would that Trump would describe as deep state operatives, career civil servants, um, highly trained bureaucrats and counselors and investigators that had their own oath, their own esprit, their own sense of what their duties and their obligations were. And they weren't interested in carrying out policies that ran counter to that self image. And they also had to think past what happens when Trump leaves office, right? When George W. Bush, a much more establishment figure, and um, whose policies and whose administration were much better integrated into um, the federal apparatus and into the Washington, D.C. circuit, when he left office, there was still some anxiety as to what would happen to, for instance, CIA or military individuals, officials that had documented links to things like torture policies or extraordinary rendition. And we saw what happened, which was nothing. The deep state protected itself. And to the extent that anybody paid a price, it was the inmates at Guantanamo Bay.
Mhm.
But with Trump, you are going to have to be even more cautious than with George W. Bush, because here's an ex president who won't be able to protect those that carried out his sketchiest policies because he'll be too busy with his own lawsuits. That was a very sensible anxiety to be had if you're called upon to carry out what could be very easily construed as extrajudicial or unconstitutional uses of force against people at the border, George Floyd protesters, students, leftists, you name it. So that was a real break, preventing the enactment of some of the more uh, repressive policies that Trump favored. Now he's getting a second bite at the apple, and he's not coming in raw. He's coming in with a very clear sense of who the opposition is, who's going to try to block him, how they blocked him in the past. Um, he it's gotten personal because the same deep state operatives that refused to carry out his policies then turned around and started investigating him aggressively as soon as he leaves office. So he's got lists of names, right? There are people that need to go.
Mhm.
With the assassination attempts against him, it goes further than legal risk. There's a potential for life and death if he can't count on the agents and leaders inside branches like the Secret Service.
Is he getting the B team of Secret Service since he's an ex-president that is unliked by the deep state?
Well, it's tricky
Mm.
with someone like Trump because the Secret Service is actually one of the most reactionary branches of federal law enforcement. There's it's just a lot of MAGA. Um, this is something that I was looking at in 2016 and 2020 when it looked like Bernie Sanders had a chance, right? I would not trust these guys to protect a leftist, democratic, socialist president. And so I think that in the rank and file, there there's no shortage of guys in the aviator sunglasses who are like, I would take a bullet for you, Mr. President. It has been an honor to die for you, Mr. President. But when it comes to the management and leadership uh, layers of the Secret Service, well, these are Bidenists. And I wouldn't be surprised if, especially after January 6th, especially given that the deep state anxieties about Trump are not unfounded. He was not given the most enthusiastic Trump people, but was given um, officers that were considered reliable from the Biden perspective.